Lawrence had always been the supportive husband, a steady presence for his wife, Teresa, and their two young children. He worked as a manager in a local firm, while Teresa was a rising star in her career, frequently traveling for business. Their life, though full of love and affection, often felt unbalanced due to her demanding job. Teresa's absences were frequent, and though Lawrence admired her dedication, a nagging feeling had begun to grow. He found himself questioning whether their family dynamic was truly as stable as he thought, especially when Teresa's work trips started to feel more and more like a distant world from his own. Something was off, but he couldn't quite place it yet. At first, Lawrence supported Teresa's career with all his heart, proud of her achievements. However, as time passed, her frequent business trips began to take a toll on their relationship. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, seemed to widen with each passing trip. Lawrence noticed she was often distracted when they spoke, her responses curt and distant. There were moments when she'd grow secretive about her phone, refusing to let it out of her sight. Lawrence initially brushed it off, attributing it to the pressures of work. Yet, over time, the subtle changes in her behavior made him uneasy. Her absences felt longer, and the warm connection they once shared seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a coldness he couldn't ignore. As her work continued to pull her away, he started to wonder if there was more to her trips than she had let on. It was a quiet Thursday evening when Lawrence's suspicions began to solidify. Teresa had been gone on another one of her business trips, and they had only exchanged a few short texts. When he tried to call her that night, she didn't pick up, a rarity in their relationship. The next day, when they spoke briefly, she was quick to end the conversation, saying she was in meetings. But Lawrence felt the distance in her voice, a coldness he hadn't heard before. As the days passed, Teresa's behavior grew even more peculiar. She began to keep her phone in a separate room, only glancing at it when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Late-night texts became a regular occurrence, and when Lawrence asked who they were from, she quickly deflected. The late-night meetings, her increasingly vague explanations about unfamiliar cities she claimed to visit, and her odd excuses for missing calls began to form an uncomfortable pattern. Lawrence was no longer sure if he was overreacting or if something truly was wrong. His gut told him something was amiss. Lawrence couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, and his suspicions grew with every passing day. He decided to take matters into his own hands. After another one of Teresa's business trips, Lawrence made the bold decision to visit her city, unannounced, and check the details for himself. His heart raced at the thought of confronting her, but part of him needed to know the truth, even if it shattered everything he believed. He carefully planned the trip, looking up the hotel she claimed to be staying at and the flight details. As he packed his bag, nervous excitement bubbled inside him. What if his suspicions were wrong? What if he was just imagining things? Yet, deep down, he knew he had to follow through. The uncertainty was unbearable, and he couldn't keep living in the dark. When Lawrence arrived at the hotel where Teresa had supposedly been staying, the ground beneath him seemed to collapse. The hotel didn't exist. His stomach churned as he called the number Teresa had given him, only to be told no such reservation had been made. Confused and desperate for answers, he tried calling the airline for confirmation of her flight, but there were discrepancies in her travel details. The more questions he asked, the more holes appeared in Teresa's story. Lawrence's heart pounded in his chest as the truth began to sink in. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. His worst fears were starting to take shape. He couldn't reach her on the phone either. The silence was deafening. Panic and disbelief flooded him. Everything he had known about his marriage, about Teresa, felt like it was unraveling before his eyes. He was finally seeing the reality that had been hidden in plain sight. When Teresa returned home a few days later, the tension between them was palpable. Lawrence wasted no time confronting her with the facts he had uncovered. His voice shook as he demanded the truth, his anger barely contained. Teresa tried to deflect at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. With tears in her eyes, she finally admitted to the affair. The full truth poured out, how long it had been going on, and the depth of her betrayal. She explained how the affair had started slowly, but it had turned into something more intense. Lawrence's world shattered as he listened to her words, the weight of her confession sinking in with every passing second. Teresa was full of remorse, offering apologies and pleas for forgiveness, but Lawrence felt numb. The emotional hurt was unbearable, and the trust they had built over the years lay in tatters at their feet. In the wake of Teresa's confession, Lawrence was left reeling. The pain of betrayal gnawed at him, leaving him feeling hollow. He struggled with disbelief, unable to comprehend how his life had spiraled so quickly. The children were confused, unaware of the growing rift between their parents, and Lawrence did his best to shield them from the unfolding chaos. Teresa left the house, and the family dynamic shifted irreparably. Lawrence was alone with his thoughts, wrestling with his emotions, while his children clung to him, innocent in their understanding of the storm that had just hit their family. As the days passed, Lawrence found himself lost in reflection, questioning everything he had once believed about his marriage. Trust, he realized, had been the foundation of their relationship, but it had been shattered in an instant. The internal struggle of whether to forgive Teresa or move on consumed him. He understood that things could never go back to the way they were, but he wasn't sure if he even wanted them to. The betrayal had changed everything, and he couldn't help but wonder how he had missed the signs. It was as if his perception of their life together had been distorted, leaving him questioning what had been real all along. Lawrence finally came to a bittersweet realization about his relationship with Teresa. The future of their marriage seemed uncertain, and his focus shifted to what was most important, his children and their well-being. He knew that healing would take time, and that forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. The emotional toll of the affair weighed heavily on him, but the road ahead was one of recovery. As he looked toward the future, he hoped for peace, both for himself and his children, and as he reflected on the painful lesson learned, he left the story for others to reflect on, how fragile trust could be, and the difficult journey of moving forward after betrayal.